Welcome back to The Spoken Word. My name is Travis, and I'm your host. In this episode, we're going to tie together everything we've learned from the book of Leviticus and see how it fits into the larger story of the whole Bible. There is so much more to learn from Leviticus, and I encourage you to use the techniques that I have modeled in this series to go and make your own discoveries. But for now, it's time that we dive into our recap and see how all of the pieces fit together. Before continuing our journey through the Bible, let's step back and see how what we've learned from Leviticus fits into the larger story. To start, what is the Bible even about? What is the story? What is the plot? In school, many of us probably learned that the plot of a story has a beginning, a middle, and an end. Specifically, they all have an exposition section or a background, a crisis, and a resolution. This includes the Bible. Here's how it flows. In Genesis 1 and 2, we get the Bible's very short background section. We get introduced to the location of the drama, this three-tiered world of sky, land, and water. We get introduced to some major characters in the plot, specifically God and humans. We also get some descriptions of the origins of our age and mankind's intended vocation as image bearers and creation managers. So that's all background. Then we hit the first major crisis section in Genesis 3, when this mysterious serpent shows up and Adam and Eve join his ranks and rebel against God. In this, we have the Bible's defining crisis: subterfuge and infiltration by a malevolent evil force, in cooperation with humans abandoning their vocation and being ruled by the snake rather than ruling it. The rest of the Bible is God working out a resolution for that specific crisis. If we remove Genesis 3 and that story about the fateful rebellion of the serpent and Adam and Eve, then the rest of the Bible is just a story about a deity fixing a non-existent problem. If we remove the background section in Genesis 1 and 2, then Genesis 3 has no real stakes or meaning. If we remove the background, the crisis has no meaning. If we remove the crisis, then the resolution has no purpose. Every other subplot in the Bible is causally linked to that initial conflict in Genesis 3, and that includes the book of Leviticus. Somehow, this obscure book about rituals and laws and all this other stuff, somehow that book has something to do with the rebellion that took place in Eden. So let's think about how the terms that we've looked at fit into the wider plot. We've discussed atonement, sin, and holiness specifically. So let's talk about each of those briefly and summarize. Sin, we saw, has its origin story in Genesis chapter 4, the chapter right after Adam and Eve join in the snake's rebellion. Sin is described like an entity or a force in this chapter more than a legal misdemeanor. Sin is treated like this wild beast that's stalking Cain and seeking to bring him down, just like the serpent brought down his parents, Adam and Eve. So when the Bible speaks about sin, it's talking about this malevolence. It's saying something about all the chaos and destruction and corruption that leads to the loss of life and goodness. That is what sin is. It's a cosmic scale problem. On the other end of the spectrum, we talked about holiness. Holiness in the Bible is a way of speaking about something that is very central to God's very nature. When God summarizes himself and calls Israel to be like him, he says, "Be holy as I am holy." When angelic beings in the Old Testament and the New Testament alike see God, their response is, "Holy, holy, holy." Holiness is God's very essence. In some ways, it is his otherness. It is his distinction from that which is typical in our experience. Whatever it is that we are used to, God is not that. That is holiness. I would suggest that you can think about holiness based on how God himself acts. If God is holy, then what he does will be holy as well. And we can see that his first defining activity in the entire biblical story is bringing order and life to a chaotic wreck of a planet. That's what a holy God does, apparently. So holiness in some aspect is all that is good. It is life, it is order, and it is all that God does and is. So sin is death and chaos, but holiness is life and order. When we say that people, places, or things are holy, it is because they are somehow harmonized or linked into this life of God. Holy things are things that belong in God's territory and serve his purposes. It's about belonging and allegiance more than just simply being special. Scarcity alone does not make something holy. So if sin and holiness are two sides in a conflict, then atonement is holiness's way of taking people and things from the domain of sin and bringing it into the domain of holiness. Sin can contaminate holy things, but somehow atonement can purge sin and unmake it. Interestingly, we saw that the means of atonement in Leviticus was to use death as a means of transforming life into a form that could combat sin and its effects. We saw that forgiveness is a judicial recognition of how effective that cleansing really was. In the Bible, forgiveness isn't just pretending that something never happened. Rather, forgiveness in the biblical sense is recognizing that something was done and that there was a problem and that that very issue has been undone. So atonement isn't about substitutionary punishment of an innocent third party just to satisfy the internal peculiarities of God's love and wrath. It's about unmaking death by using death itself to spread life and order. The Bible presents us with a cosmic logic of atonement, not a tiny legalistic logic that you can fold up and fit in your back pocket. We need to retrain ourselves to think on much bigger scales. Remember, we learned from Leviticus that when God was going to dwell with the people and take a step back towards the Garden of Eden, he was confronted with the problem of sin. And to deal with it, he assembled a priesthood, not a court. Even when the Bible uses courtroom language, it is to describe the result of leaving the sin undealt with by priestly means. Let me try to tell a parable that makes all of this cosmic level stuff somewhat more tangible and relatable. Imagine that there's a country that accidentally releases a biological weapon within its own borders. This thing contaminates and kills everywhere that it spreads. It even corrupts the very DNA of its hosts, making people that get infected by it not truly human, even on the genetic level. So an international court assembles and they issue this judgment. The country responsible for the mishap will be quarantined. Nobody that lives there gets to leave. And the responsible country has to clean up the mess. Otherwise, the population is going to get consumed when a nuclear strike gets sent to burn everything inside the quarantine zone. So a medical team is sent to start administering antidotes and reverse these infected people back to true humans. Once people are decontaminated and they get their genomes restored to normal human DNA, they can safely start a new life on uncorrupted soil. Anybody that refuses treatment will remain quarantined and they will get burned along with everything else, including the disease when the nuclear strike comes. Anybody that tries to leave the quarantine zone without treatment will be neutralized on site by guards to protect the rest of the world from this corrupting disease. Now, that all may seem rather harsh, but that is more akin to the biblical story than most of us probably realize. In my story, the biological weapon is sin. Holiness is everything that belongs to the unpolluted parts of the world. Atonement is the restorative gene therapy that's given by the medical team, who are themselves like priests. The court that issued the quarantine edict to begin with is God and his divine counsel. The impending nuclear strike is Judgment Day. And getting shot on sight for leaving the country without treatment is what happens when a contaminated thing comes into contact with that which is holy. This is how the Bible envisions the kind of problem that we face and therefore the kind of solution that we need. This is all woven into the narrative of the Bible, not outlined in a systematic theology textbook in neat bullet points. The Bible presents us with a story, not a catechism. We just have to connect the dots within the context of the broader story to make meaning of all this. I really can't emphasize how important this is. If we pull biblical words like atonement or holiness or sin out of the biblical story that they are defined in, we will misunderstand them. If we misunderstand the plot and we get it wrong, then we will get the crisis wrong. If we get the crisis wrong, we will get the solution wrong. And at the end of the day, we will end up with a gospel that solves problems that the Bible itself never even describes. So I want to challenge you, spend time in the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible. They define the storyline and the vocabulary of the entire biblical story. When Jesus, the apostles, the prophets, or the poets, or any other biblical author speak about atonement or sin or holiness, or pretty much anything else, they are drawing from these earliest books of the Bible, especially Leviticus. The Torah defines the shape of the crisis that the rest of the Bible seeks to resolve. But that's all from me for now. Next time, we're going to leave Mount Sinai at last, and we're going to head out into the wilderness and towards the Promised Land. But until then, keep reading, keep asking questions, and remember, if we are ever going to get back to Eden, Leviticus tells us that we are going to need the help of a priest. Thanks for listening, and God bless.